Hollywood has seen its fair share of controversial interviews, but few have been as impactful as this one. Sylvester Stallone, one of the greatest action movie icons, was invited to one of the industry's biggest talk shows. What was supposed to be a relaxed conversation about his career took an unexpected turn when an arrogant critic decided to challenge him live. The provocation was direct and blunt. "Your movies promote an outdated and toxic view of masculinity." The intent was clear, to undermine Stallone's legacy and force him to justify himself. But what no one expected was the response that followed. With the composure of a true fighter, Stallone not only countered the accusation, but also exposed a truth that many try to ignore. Audiences refuse to be force-fed ideology. The silence that filled the studio was deafening. The critic, who had been so confident moments earlier, now struggled to maintain his composure. What exactly did Stallone say to completely silence his opponent? How did a simple comment turn into a historic moment? Stay until the end and see why this interview became legendary. Oh, and before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more epic stories like this. Hollywood has always been a stage for unforgettable interviews, but that night, something special was about to unfold. The guest on the biggest talk show of the moment wasn't just any actor. It was Sylvester Stallone, a living legend, a name that had shaped action cinema like few others in history. As he walked onto the set, the audience erupted in applause, cheers echoing throughout the studio. There was an almost reverential respect for this man who had built his career on perseverance and raw strength, both on screen and in real life. The host, smiling and visibly excited, began the interview in a light-hearted manner. They talked about the struggles of Stallone's early career, how he had to sell even his own dog to survive before he made it big. Always humble, Stallone answered in his signature deep, gravelly voice, drawing laughter and admiration from the crowd. Everything seemed to follow the usual script of a talk show until the conversation took an unexpected turn. Without warning, the host introduced a surprise guest. A well-known film critic, infamous for his harsh opinions, stepped onto the stage. The applause turned hesitant, with a few scattered boos from the audience. The atmosphere remained expectant. Stallone sat up slightly straighter, his eyes narrowing, just a bit, as if he already sensed what was coming. From that moment on, the conversation would be anything but friendly. The critic started subtly, offering polite praise for Stallone's cultural impact. But beneath his words, there was an unmistakable edge. He spoke about how cinema had evolved, how times had changed, and then, with a rehearsed smirk, he delivered his first provocation. The audience immediately felt the shift in tone. The host glanced nervously around, trying to maintain control, but the moment had already taken on a life of its own. Stallone, a man who had fought far greater battles than this, remained composed. Life had taught him that sometimes the best way to win a fight was to let the opponent expose himself first. The audience, once relaxed and laughing, was now completely engaged. Some leaned forward in their seats, while others exchanged glances, sensing that something big was about to happen. The host, realizing the tension rising, attempted to step in, but the critic ignored him, pressing forward. He wanted to provoke Stallone, to make him stumble over his own words. But what he didn't realize was that he was about to learn why certain icons never go out of style. And then, the moment of truth arrived. The silence in the studio lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough for everyone to realize that something big was about to happen. The critic adjusted his microphone, looked directly at Stallone, and with a smug smile, launched his attack. "The truth," he began, pausing dramatically, "is that your movies promote an outdated, toxic, and violent view of masculinity. You represent an era that should have been left in the past." The entire studio seemed to hold its breath. The provocation had been carefully crafted, with the clear intent of diminishing Stallone and putting him on the spot in front of millions of viewers. The critic crossed his arms, waiting for a reaction, convinced that he had already won the debate before it had even begun. It was as if he wanted to lecture the actor on the new cinema, where stories had to follow a certain agenda and old-school heroes no longer had a place. But Stallone wasn't just any man. He had built his career facing rejection, closed doors, and critics who once said he would never make it. He had heard it all over the years, that he wasn't talented enough, that he would never be a star, that his films were too simplistic. And yet there he was, decades later, still at the top, while many of his critics had been long forgotten. His eyes narrowed slightly. The audience, which had been laughing and clapping just moments earlier, was now completely silent, watching intently. The host shuffled his cue cards nervously, sensing the situation slipping from his control. But no one dared to interrupt the silence that had overtaken the room. The critic, still confident, gestured dramatically with his hands, reinforcing his point. "Think about it," he continued. "Times have changed. People don't want these violent characters anymore, these outdated narratives. The world has moved on." He chuckled slightly, shaking his head as if disappointed to even have to explain something so obvious. Then Stallone leaned forward slightly. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to get angry. All it took was a firm look and a deep breath, and the entire studio braced itself for what was coming next. And at that moment, the critic realized he had just made a mistake. Sylvester Stallone locked eyes with the critic, his expression unreadable. The silence in the studio was thick, almost suffocating. The tension was undeniable. The critic, still wearing a smug smile, crossed his arms, expecting a predictable reaction. Perhaps a defensive speech, maybe even an attempt to smooth things over. But he clearly didn't know Stallone. The actor took a deep breath, leaned slightly forward, and in his deep, unmistakable voice fired back, "Outdated? Then explain to me why my movies still fill theaters, while your ideological pamphlets keep failing one after another." His tone wasn't angry, it was firm, resolute. The voice of a man who didn't apologize for who he was. The provocation hit hard. The critic's smile twitched as he tried to maintain his composure, but his eyes betrayed him. He hadn't expected such a direct counterattack. The audience, which had been dead silent just moments ago, started reacting. Low murmurs, some gasps, even a few muffled laughs, but Stallone wasn't finished. If there's one thing audiences don't want, it's being force-fed garbage disguised as entertainment. A collective "oh" rippled through the crowd. The host, visibly uneasy, fidgeted in his chair, flipping through his cue cards in a desperate attempt to regain control. The critic opened his mouth to respond, but Stallone raised a hand slightly, a subtle but clear gesture that said, "Wait, I'm not done yet." His words carried weight, each, one landing like a well-placed punch. People want real heroes. They want stories that inspire them, that make them feel something. But these days, you try to turn everything into a political sermon, try to rewrite what it means to be a man, what it means to be strong, and guess what? Audiences aren't buying it. The critic swallowed hard. The confident smirk was gone. He shifted in his seat, trying to appear unaffected, but the damage was done. Stallone had just turned the tables. And the best part, he was just getting started. The weight of Stallone's words still hung in the air. The entire studio seemed to have frozen in place, holding its breath. The critic, who had been so confident just moments before, now avoided eye contact, his posture stiff. The host glanced nervously between them, searching for a way to steer the conversation back to safer ground, but there was no undoing what had just happened. The awkward silence stretched longer than anyone expected. The host cleared his throat, forcing a smile. "Well, that's certainly an interesting perspective." His voice was unsteady, betraying his discomfort. Behind the cameras, the production team exchanged glances, unsure whether to intervene. But Stallone wasn't done yet. He knew this was the moment to drive the final nail in the coffin. Leaning back slightly in his chair, now completely at ease, he gestured toward the critic with a knowing look. You want men to be weak, submissive, apologetic for even existing. But do you know what happens when you try to erase the values that built this country? The audience rejects it. And that's why I'm still here, while you all are fading away. The studio erupted, not in laughter this time, but in a stunned wave of murmurs and nods of agreement. The audience, which had hesitated before, now seemed to awaken. A few scattered claps could be heard, slowly growing louder. Stallone had struck a chord, and everyone knew it. The critic crossed his arms, his expression unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. He had nothing left to say. The host, now clearly desperate to regain control of the interview, forced a laugh and hurriedly changed the subject, asking Stallone about his upcoming projects. But the damage was done. Nobody cared about the planned questions anymore. The cameras zoomed in on Stallone's face. He didn't need to gloat, didn't need to say another word. His expression alone said everything. And though the applause hadn't fully erupted yet, everyone present knew that this moment had already become legendary. But the night wasn't over just yet. There was still one final blow left to land. The silence already spoke for itself, but Stallone had one last bullet in the chamber. The critic, still trying to salvage his credibility, adjusted himself in his chair and opened his mouth to respond. But he never got the chance. Before he could utter a single word, Stallone cut him off with a calm yet razor-sharp remark. You can complain, you can criticize, but at the end of the day, no one buys a ticket to watch a lecture from spoiled people. The crowd couldn't hold back. The applause started softly, scattered at first, but quickly built into a roaring ovation that filled the entire studio. The critic sat motionless. It was obvious that he wanted to respond, but what could he possibly say? Stallone hadn't just dismantled his arguments. He had won over the entire audience in the process. The host tried to wrap up the interview with a forced smile, but everyone knew that the moment had already transcended the usual talk show format. Stallone, completely unfazed, stood up, and as if on cue, the audience rose to their feet, erupting into another wave of cheers. He hadn't asked for it, hadn't demanded recognition, but respect is something earned, not given. The critic lowered, his head avoiding eye contact. The man who had attempted to undermine an action cinema icon now looked small, insignificant. His carefully crafted rhetoric had been shattered, not by anger, not by insults, but by simple, undeniable truth. The camera captured the moment. Stallone gave a slight smirk, nodded to the audience, and walked off the stage under a thunderous ovation. He didn't need to say another word. His response would echo far beyond that studio, cementing itself as one of the most memorable moments in talk show history. The interview was over, but that night would be remembered for years to come. Stallone had just proven once again why legends never fade. And just like that, in front of millions of viewers, Stallone didn't just defend his legacy, he reaffirmed why he remains a living legend. While many try to rewrite cinema history, erasing everything that doesn't fit into their new rules, audiences continue to seek authenticity, emotion, and heroes who truly inspire them. The critic's silence was more revealing than any response he could have given. When the truth is spoken with conviction, no argument can stand against it. What happened in that studio wasn't just a clash of opinions. It was proof that certain narratives simply collapse when confronted with reality. But what do you think about all of this? Has classic action cinema really become outdated, or is there still room for real heroes? Does Hollywood need to hear more voices like Stallone's? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more epic moments like this. Turn on notifications so you never miss a video.